Most people assume you need a big backyard to grow real fruit, but that is exactly why so many small space gardeners never even start. The truth is, some fruit trees crop better in containers than they do in the ground, if you choose the right ones. In this video, I'm going to show you 10 fruit trees and fruiting plants that can thrive in pots on a patio, balcony, or small backyard, and give you harvests that are actually worth the effort. Stay with me, because one of them is far easier than most people think. One is a terrible choice unless you know the trick, and the one near the end can keep producing long after most gardeners would have given up. If you have ever looked at an empty corner and thought it was too small for fruit, this may be the video that changes your mind. Now, before we get into the list, let me save you from the mistake that ruins more container fruit than cold weather ever does. People buy a tree first and ask questions later. They fall in love with the picture on the tag, bring it home, drop it into the biggest decorative pot they can find, and assume fruit is on the way. Then by midsummer, the leaves look tired, the soil swings from soaking wet to bone dry, and the tree spends the whole season trying to recover instead of trying to crop. That is the first correction. In containers, you do not start with the fruit. You start with control. You want a variety that stays naturally compact, a pot with real drainage, and a place that gets honest sun, not bright shade, not a bit of morning light, but enough direct light to make the plant earn its keep. A fruit tree in the ground can forgive a weak spot. A fruit tree in a pot usually cannot. The good news is that once you understand that, container growing gets a whole lot easier, because now you are working with the plant instead of against it. And here is the first myth worth clearing up. Bigger pot does not always mean better fruit. A pot that is too large often stays too wet for too long, especially in cool spring weather, and that leads to soft roots, slow growth, and a tree that never settles. What you want is enough root room to support the plant, but not so much cold, soggy compost that the whole root zone turns into a waiting room for trouble. That matters more than most beginners realize, and it is one reason some fruits are much smarter choices for containers than others. One of the smartest is fig. If you want a fruiting plant that does not need a huge footprint and does not panic every time life gets a little imperfect, fig is hard to beat. This is one of the few plants where a little root restriction can actually work in your favor. That surprises people, because they think a pampered plant is always a productive plant, not with figs. A fig that is given too much room and too much rich feeding often gives you what looks impressive at first: long shoots, giant leaves, and not nearly enough fruit to justify the space. The plant looks busy, but it is not doing the job you bought it for. That is the hidden cause a lot of people miss. They think the tree is thriving because it is growing hard. Sometimes that is exactly the problem. A compact fig in a sensible container set in a warm, sunny spot can be one of the most rewarding things you grow. It can handle pruning. It can be moved to shelter in a rough winter. And in cooler parts of the US and Europe, that matters more than people think. A fig near a south-facing wall, on a patio that gathers heat, behaves very differently from one left exposed in a windy open space. Same plant, different judgment, different result. There is also a taste argument here, and it is a strong one. Fresh figs are one of the few fruits that are almost never at their best by the time they reach the shop. They bruise easily, they do not travel well, and a fig picked too early never really makes up for it later. So when a container fig works, the reward is not just fruit. It is a kind of fruit most people almost never get to taste properly. That is a real payoff, and it is why fig belongs high on this list. Now, if fig teaches you not to overdo it, blueberry teaches you to get the root zone right from day one. Blueberries are not difficult in containers, but they are unforgiving about one thing: acidity. This is where people go wrong. They use standard potting mix, water from a hard tap all summer, and then act surprised when the leaves start paling, the growth weakens, and the berries are sparse. That is not bad luck. That is a plant sitting in the wrong chemistry. The practical correction is simple. If you want blueberries to work, treat them like blueberries from the start. Use an acidic mix, keep the moisture even, and do not let the pot dry out hard and then flood it again. That feast and famine watering pattern stresses the roots and shows up later in weak growth and poor fruit set. People blame the weather for that all the time. More often than not, it is the watering. And here is the nice surprise with blueberries in pots. In ordinary garden soil, especially in chalky or alkaline ground, they can be a constant argument. In a container, you stop arguing and simply give them what they need. That is one of those moments where the container is not second best at all. It is actually the cleaner, smarter system. A good compact blueberry on a patio does more than earn its space. It gives you a fruit that is expensive to buy, quick to snack on, easy to protect from a late cold snap, and far easier to net from birds than a sprawling bush in the ground. That last part matters. The common mistake is waiting until the berries are fully blue before thinking about protection. Birds are watching before you are. If you want the crop, be earlier than the birds. And while we are on the subject of plants that pay their way, let's talk about the one most people think of first: lemon. Now, a lot of container fruit videos mention lemon, but they usually leave out why it works for some people and disappoints the rest. The problem is not that lemon is a bad container plant. The problem is that people hear grow lemons in pots and assume all they need is sunshine and enthusiasm. Citrus asks for a bit more judgment than that. A Meyer lemon, or another naturally compact citrus, can be a beautiful thing in a container. Flowers, fragrance, young fruit, ripe fruit, all on one plant if it is happy. But citrus has a habit of exposing sloppy care. If the drainage is poor, it shows you. If the feeding is weak, it shows you. If winter light indoors is too low, it shows you. And one of the most common mistakes is bringing citrus inside too late, after the cold has already stressed it, then setting it in a dim corner and wondering why it sulks for 2 months. This is where container growing becomes an advantage again. A tree in the ground is stuck with your weather. A tree in a pot can be moved before the damage is done. Closer to the house, into shelter, into a bright greenhouse or conservatory if you have one, even onto a sunnier section of the patio once the season turns. That flexibility is what makes citrus possible for far more people than most gardeners assume. But there is a myth here too. Citrus is not a miracle beginner tree just because it looks good in a pot. If you tend to forget watering, if you have very limited direct sun, or if you cannot give it decent winter conditions, citrus may not be the first fruit I would start with. It can reward you handsomely, but only if the basics are steady, and that is the difference between a tree that merely survives and one that actually loads up with usable fruit. Now the next one surprises people because it sounds more demanding than it really is when you understand one simple job you have to do by hand. Now the next one surprises people because it sounds more demanding than it really is when you understand one simple job you have to do by hand. Peach. A lot of gardeners hear peach in a pot and think that sounds like asking for trouble. In truth, a dwarf peach can be one of the most satisfying trees you grow in a container, but only if you stop trying to let the tree decide how many peaches it wants to carry. That is where people lose control. The tree sets far more fruit than it can finish well. The branches get crowded, the peaches stay small, and the whole plant tires itself out trying to mature too much at once. So here is the practical correction. When those little fruits are still young, thin them, take some off, usually more than feels comfortable. I know beginners hate doing that. It feels like waste. It feels like you are throwing away your harvest. In reality, you are rescuing it. Fewer peaches means better size, better sweetness, better airflow, less strain on the branches, and a healthier tree going into next season. It is one of those jobs that feels wrong until you do it once and see the difference. And container peaches have an advantage most people overlook. Protection. If a late frost threatens the blossom, a potted tree can be moved closer to shelter. If birds start pecking ripe fruit, a compact tree is far easier to net. If the weather turns wet and miserable, you can at least shift the plant to the best spot you have, instead of just watching from the kitchen window while the season goes sideways. That kind of flexibility matters in places where spring cannot make up its mind, and that includes a lot of the US and Europe. There is also a quality issue with peaches that makes them especially worth growing at home. Shop peaches are usually picked firm because they have to travel. But a peach that ripens properly on the tree is an entirely different fruit, softer, deeper, sweeter, more fragrant. That is one of the real themes running through this whole list. Some fruits save money, some save disappointment. Peaches do both. Now apples are a different story, because apples tempt people into two mistakes at once. First, they buy the wrong tree. Second, they assume a tree that fits in a container will behave like a patio ornament and crop without much planning. Apples can do well in containers, but only if you understand that form matters. This is where columnar or very compact apples earn their place. A columnar apple makes sense in small spaces because it grows upward more than outward. That means one tree can slip into a narrow corner of a patio, sit along a path, or stand in a row without swallowing all the room around it. For somebody with a balcony, a courtyard, or a small deck, that is a serious advantage. You are not trying to manage a broad, hungry canopy in a pot. You are working with a shape that was made for restraint. But here is the hidden symptom with apples in containers. Lots of blossom does not always mean a worthwhile crop is coming. People see flowers, relax, and assume they have done their part. Then the tree drops the little fruits, or carries a few disappointing apples, and they blame the variety. Sometimes the real problem is lack of pollination. Sometimes it is inconsistent watering while the fruits are swelling. Sometimes it is that the tree is still too young, and the gardener is trying to get a full harvest before the plant has built enough strength to support one. That is why patience matters more with apples than the catalogs like to admit. A good apple tree in a container is not a weekend novelty. It is a small system. You feed it steadily, water it properly, keep an eye on pests, and give it time to settle into its rhythm. Do that, and the reward is fruit that stores well, which makes apples different from figs and peaches. A ripe fig wants eating straight away. An apple keeps the garden going into colder weather. That matters when you are trying to make a small space productive beyond just one burst of summer excitement. And then there are cherries, which might be the most misunderstood fruit on this list. People love the idea of cherries, but in a large garden, they can become a battle with height, birds, and timing. In a container, especially with a compact sour cherry or a very manageable dwarf type, that whole picture changes. The tree stays reachable. The fruit stays visible. The netting becomes practical. You are finally working at a scale where your effort has a chance of winning. That matters because birds are ruthless with cherries. This is one of the classic common mistakes. Gardeners wait until the fruit starts looking nearly ready, then think, I should probably cover that tomorrow. By tomorrow, half the crop is gone. If you want cherries, act early. The birds do not need your permission, and they do not care how long you waited for the fruit to ripen. Sour cherries also deserve more respect than they get. A lot of people hear sour and think second best. That is a mistake. A good sour cherry is useful in ways sweet cherry often is not. Fresh eating, baking, jam, preserving, freezing. And in a small, productive garden, useful beats glamorous every time. A tree that gives you fruit you can actually use well is more valuable than one that sounds impressive and lets you down in real conditions. This is really the dividing line in container fruit growing. You are not looking for the most exotic option. You are looking for the plant most likely to reward the way you actually live. If your spring is wet, your summers are irregular, your space is tight, and your time is not unlimited, then reliability matters more than novelty. The gardener who understands that usually ends up with more fruit, not less. And once you start thinking that way, there is a fruiting plant that begins to look a lot smarter than many people expect. It is fast, it is generous, it fits almost anywhere, and if you manage it properly, it can keep a small garden producing when the bigger trees are still taking their time. And once you start thinking that way, there is a fruiting plant that begins to look a lot smarter than many people expect. It is fast, it is generous, it fits almost anywhere, and if you manage it properly, it can keep a small garden producing when the bigger trees are still taking their time. Strawberries. Now I know they are not trees, but leaving them out of a serious container fruit conversation would be a mistake. In fact, For a lot of small gardens, strawberries are the smartest place to prove to yourself that container fruit growing is worth the trouble. They crop early. They do not ask for a huge root run, and they give you feedback fast. That matters. A fig teaches patience. A lemon teaches consistency. Strawberries teach momentum. And they do something else that many patio fruit trees do not. They start paying you back quickly. You do not wait years to find out whether your system works. Within one season, sometimes within months depending on how you start, you can be picking fruit often enough to change how you think about the space. That is important for beginners. A small success changes the way people garden. They water better, they notice more, they make room for one more pot, then another. But there is a mistake here too, and it is one I see all the time. People treat strawberries like they are permanent and self-managing. They are productive, yes, but they are not set and forget. Old plants slow down. Crowded plants lose vigor. Containers dry quickly in warm weather, especially hanging baskets and vertical systems. So the practical correction is simple. Refresh them. Keep your strongest runners. Replace tired plants. Do not cling to a declining strawberry patch out of sentiment. A small container system works best when it stays young and active. That is one reason strawberries are so useful in tight spaces. They are adaptable. Hanging baskets, window boxes, stacked planters, shallow troughs, strawberry towers if you like them. Though I will say this, choose systems you can actually water well. The clever-looking setup that dries out in one hot afternoon is not clever for long. Good container gardening is often less about invention and more about choosing a system you can manage in real weather. And if you have only ever eaten supermarket strawberries, then homegrown berries are one of the quickest ways to understand why people get hooked on this. The flavor is not a little better. It is entirely different. A ripe berry, picked warm, with real sweetness and fragrance, does not need much explaining. That is one of those moments that turns a casual grower into someone who starts planning next year's layout before this season is even finished. Now let's move to a fruit that does almost the opposite. It asks more patience up front, but once it settles in, it can be tougher and more forgiving than people expect. Pomegranate does not get talked about enough in small space fruit growing, and I think that is a mistake. A good compact pomegranate is one of those plants that makes sense for people who want something productive but also resilient. It handles dry spells better than many soft-fruited plants once established. It does not wilt into melodrama the moment the weather turns hot. And in a container, that character matters. Life is busy. People miss a watering. A heat wave comes through. A plant that can recover from a little imperfection is worth more than one that needs constant babysitting. But here is the surprise with pomegranate. People often think a tough plant can just be ignored. That is not the lesson. Tough is not the same as neglected. A pomegranate in a pot still needs sun, drainage, and feeding if you expect worthwhile fruit. The common mistake is assuming drought tolerance means container tolerance without attention. In the ground, a mature plant can go looking for what it needs. In a pot, it still depends on you. The difference is that pomegranate usually handles your learning curve better than some other fruits. It also earns its place because it gives you more than one season of interest. Good foliage, bright flowers, handsome fruit, and a plant that still looks like something even when it is not at peak harvest. In a small garden, that matters. Every container should justify itself in more than one way if possible. A plant that is only attractive for 10 days a year has to work a lot harder to keep its place. And if you live in a climate with hot summers, dry spells, or a sheltered sunny wall that gets real heat, pomegranate starts to make more and more sense. In cooler places, it may still do well in a container, especially when you can give it the warmest position you have and a bit of winter protection. Again, that is the quiet power of container growing. You are not locked into one patch of ground. You can improve a climate by a few crucial degrees simply by choosing the right corner. Now I want to come back to something people rarely hear in these videos, because it affects nearly every fruit on this list. A productive plant and a happy-looking plant are not always the same thing. This is especially true in containers. Too much nitrogen, too much pot, too much watering, too much fuss, and you can end up with a plant that looks lush and healthy to a beginner, while quietly failing at the one job you wanted from it. That is the hidden symptom I want you to remember. Lots of leaf does not always mean lots of future fruit. You see this with citrus. You see it with figs. You can even see it with strawberries when the feeding runs too soft and leafy. Gardeners get encouraged by the wrong signs. They say, "Look how much growth I've got." But the better question is, what kind of growth is it? Balanced, sturdy, fruit-supporting growth is what you want, not a green explosion that leaves you disappointed at picking time. And that brings me to one of the best small-space fruit habits you can build. Start with 1 or 2 plants that are likely to reward you, then add difficulty later. Do not build your whole patio around demanding choices in year 1. That is how people burn out. A fig, a blueberry, a strawberry trough, a compact apple, these are sensible beginnings. Once your watering, feeding, placement, and winter routine feel natural, then you can experiment with the plants that need a steadier hand. Because yes, there are fruits that sound wonderful in a container and can be done, but they are not the right first move for most people. One of them is hugely popular, heavily romanticized, expensive to keep buying at the shop, and absolutely worth growing only if you understand the one trick that stops it from becoming a slow, expensive disappointment. Because yes, there are fruits that sound wonderful in a container and can be done, but they are not the right first move for most people. One of them is hugely popular, heavily romanticized, expensive to keep buying at the shop, and absolutely worth growing only if you understand the one trick that stops it from becoming a slow, expensive disappointment. Avocado. Now let me be fair here. You can grow avocado in a container, and some gardeners do it very well. But this is where a lot of videos oversell the dream and skip the discipline. People hear dwarf avocado, imagine a neat little patio tree loaded with fruit, and forget that avocado still wants strong light, sharp drainage, warmth, patience, and a grower who does not smother it. That last part matters more than most people realize. The terrible choice is not avocado itself. The terrible choice is starting with avocado because you like eating them, and assuming that is enough reason. It is not. Avocado is one of those plants that punishes impatience in slow motion. It does not always collapse dramatically. Sometimes it just sits there, looking vaguely alive, making modest growth, asking for years of your attention while giving very little back. That is how people end up with an expensive decorative plant instead of a productive one. The trick is drainage and restraint. If the mix stays heavy and wet, avocado roots suffer fast. If the container is badly drained, the problem gets worse. If you water on a schedule instead of by need, you can spend an entire season setting the plant back without noticing until the leaves start telling the truth. And here is the symptom to watch for. Not just yellowing, but a tree that never seems to push with confidence. Weak flushes, tired-looking leaves, stalled growth. That is often the root zone, asking for air, not more kindness. So yes, avocado can be done. Yes, it can be worth it if you have the climate, the light, and the patience. But for most beginners in the US or Europe, especially if winter means bringing plants inside, this is not the first fruit I would build my confidence on. This is a later plant, a better second-wave experiment. The gardener who succeeds with avocado usually already knows how to read moisture, manage container drainage, and accept that not every good plant is a quick return plant. Banana is another one people either underestimate or misunderstand completely. It sounds tropical and difficult, or it sounds easy because the plant grows quickly. The truth sits somewhere in the middle. A dwarf banana in a container can be one of the most dramatic and satisfying things in a small garden, but only if you understand what kind of satisfaction you are signing up for. Banana gives speed, presence, and momentum. Even before fruit, it makes a space feel lush and alive. On a patio, by a greenhouse, in a sheltered, sunny corner, it creates that sense that the garden is really doing something. And that is not trivial. Sometimes a productive garden also needs one plant that changes the feeling of the whole place. Banana can do that. But here is the mild surprise. The challenge with banana is often not getting it to grow. It is feeding and watering it steadily enough without letting conditions swing too wildly. Banana likes richness, warmth, and consistency. In a container, that means you have to stay ahead of its appetite in summer and think realistically about winter. If you live where cold weather bites hard, you need a plan before the plant arrives, not after. Where will it go? How much light will it get? How much space will it take when the weather turns? This is why banana is exciting, but not universal. In the right setup, it can be brilliant. In the wrong one, it becomes a large, hungry ornament you keep rescuing. Still, for gardeners with a warm growing season, a sheltered spot, and room to overwinter, it can absolutely be one of the most memorable container fruits you ever grow. And when it sends up pups, that is when the whole thing starts to feel like a system instead of a one-off purchase. One plant becomes two, two becomes a little colony. That is how productive gardens really start to take shape. Now, after all that, you might expect the final advice to be about fertilizer or pruning or some special trick for one specific fruit. It is not. The thing that quietly improves almost every container fruit setup is much simpler than that, and most people leave it out because it looks too ordinary to matter. Mulch. A layer of mulch on top of the compost is one of the cheapest corrections you can make, and in warm weather, it can change the way a pot behaves. It slows moisture loss. It softens temperature swings at the surface. It helps stop the top layer from baking hard in sun, and then shedding water when you finally irrigate. And in a container, those little daily swings add up. People think their watering problem is about quantity, when sometimes it is really about stability. Wood chips, bark, straw, even a simple organic surface layer that fits the crop and your conditions, it all helps more than most beginners expect. The real consequence of skipping it shows up in midsummer. Pots heat fast, dry fast, and stress fast. Then the plant drops fruit, stalls, or spends the rest of the season just trying to recover. Gardeners call that bad luck. Very often, it is just exposed compost losing moisture too quickly. That is the thread running through this whole video. Good container fruit growing is not about chasing exotic plants or buying the perfect expensive setup. It is about removing avoidable stress. Choose a fruit that suits your climate and your habits. Use a container that drains properly. Give it the right amount of root room, not unlimited space. Keep the watering steady. Protect the crop before pests or birds beat you to it. Mulch the surface. Pay attention to what the plant is telling you, not what the label promised. And maybe most important of all, do not measure success by what sounds impressive. Measure it by what actually crops in your conditions. A fig that fruits reliably on a warm patio is more useful than an avocado you spend 3 years worrying over. A trough of strawberries that feeds you for months is more valuable than a glamorous tree that never settles. A compact blueberry growing happily in the right acidic mix is a better gardener's choice than a difficult plant you picked for the photo. This is one of those areas where sensible beats ambitious, at least at the start. If I were helping somebody set up a first small space fruit garden tomorrow, I would not tell them to chase everything at once. I would tell them to begin with the plants most likely to reward attention quickly and teach the right lessons. A fig if they have sun and patience. Blueberries if they can give the roots the acidity they need. Strawberries for fast returns and daily picking. A compact apple or cherry if they want a proper little tree and are ready to manage it. Citrus if they truly have the light and winter setup for it. Then, once those habits are in place, they can move into the more demanding experiments with a much better chance of success. Because the truth is, you do not need acres. You do not need a full orchard. You do not even need perfect conditions. You need a few good decisions repeated consistently. That is how an empty patio corner becomes a fruit garden. That is how a balcony starts feeding you. That is how a small backyard becomes more useful, more beautiful, and a whole lot more satisfying. And once you get that first real harvest, whether it is a handful of warm strawberries, a bowl of blueberries, a soft ripe fig, or a lemon you cut from your own tree, something shifts. You stop seeing containers as decorations. You start seeing them as productive ground. And after that, small space gardening never quite looks small again. If you learned something useful today, type GROW in the comments and press like. I always enjoy hearing what people are planting, what is working, and what they are trying to figure out next.